The floodlights blazed to life like rifle shots. Midnight had passed in a snow-blanketed prisoner-of-war facility near Saint-Dié, France, December 1944. Within the female quarters, the atmosphere reeked of moist fabric and terror. Sentries yelled across the frozen hallway, "Wake everyone for assembly outdoors." Footwear struck the wooden planks. Covers were abandoned. Nobody understood the reason. The females, previous administrative workers, wireless technicians, and medical staff from the German support units, marched into the bitter darkness, certain individuals unshod, others still partially drowsy. Their exhalations lingered as vapor while searchlights cut across the mist. They had existed as captives for several weeks, yet this felt distinct. No attendance check had ever occurred at this hour. A British commanding officer wearing an overcoat positioned himself at the entrance, expression emotionless, document holder beneath his limb. He remained silent, merely indicated direction. The females formed a line beneath the harsh illumination, trembling in sleeping garments, frozen earth gripping their lower legs. The gale screamed across the wire barriers, transporting murmurs. Is this retribution? Death sentence? A single female uttered a supplication. Another gnawed her mouth until crimson appeared. The quietness from the sentries felt more oppressive than the frigid temperature. Then, somewhere toward the camp's eastern boundary, a noise commenced. Low, mechanical, persistent. It wasn't cannon fire nor aircraft. A droning that intensified, more constant, as though the ground beneath was awakening. The females rotated their attention toward the disturbance. The commanding officer checked his timepiece, then surveyed the distant line. Motors, countless in number. The terrain vibrated beneath the haze. Vehicle lights started to emerge, columns of transport vehicles advancing in precise arrangement. The captives tensed. Transport vehicles after dark signified a single possibility in the Reich: relocations or execution squads. Yet the British sentries failed to lift weapons. They merely stood waiting. A single female, a 22-year-old stenographer from Cologne, subsequently documented, "We believed we had prepared our final resting places." Her jaw shook as the procession approached nearer, motors reverberating against the shelter structures. The petroleum odor arrived before the headlamps, dense, greasy, unfamiliar. 5, 10, 15 transport vehicles passed the entrance. Their fabric covers lowered, their operators blank-faced under metal headgear. The droning transformed into thunder. Floodlights wavered as emission vapors blended with frozen precipitation. And then, without utterance, the commanding officer lifted his limb and motioned eastward toward the noise that consumed the darkness. The females pursued his line of sight. Something beyond was approaching nearer, more thunderous, more substantial, and none among them could yet predict what they were preparing to observe. Motors rumbled in the remoteness, profound and measured, like electrical storms woven with industrial sounds. The females peered into the haze as the initial transport vehicle penetrated the vapor. An Allied procession advancing gradually in flawless arrangement, its headlamps traversed across their features, temporarily dazzling, transforming each droplet into crystal. They steadied themselves reflexively, anticipating troops to descend bellowing instructions. Yet the personnel in tan uniforms simply continued operating. No armaments elevated, no directives shouted. The atmosphere was saturated with petroleum and incredulity. "Not armored vehicles," a single female murmured. "Not captives either." Another contributed. "Then what purpose?" The British commanding officer observed wordlessly, palms joined behind his torso, vision concentrated on the formation that appeared infinite. The procession extended for almost a mile, canvas-covered transport vehicles branded with pale stars, wheels crushing through partially melted snow. The motors never wavered. Their order was robotic, nearly unsettling. To the captives, the spectacle was dreamlike. The adversary advancing with such composed exactness while their native military was disintegrating throughout Europe. Each transport vehicle transported approximately 200 gallons of petroleum. Component of what they subsequently discovered was the Red Ball Express, an unceasing artery of provision transport vehicles sustaining the Allied progression. Every 20 minutes, fresh processions passed through like arteries delivering metal and flame to the combat zone. For each solitary German transport vehicle capable of movement, Allied manufacturing dispatched 10. The calculation was overwhelming. "We had hungered for days," one prisoner of war subsequently documented. "They possessed petroleum sufficient to illuminate the heavens." That understanding struck more forcefully than any questioning session could. These weren't merely transport vehicles. They represented evidence. Evidence that Germany's military apparatus had already forfeited the competition, submerged beneath the absolute magnitude of Allied prosperity. And yet the transport vehicles failed to halt at the entrance. They turned leftward, encircling the facility's boundary. Motors idled, mechanisms rotated, and troops descended, not bearing weapons, but wielding prying tools and document holders. The females shared bewildered expressions. Then arrived the instruction in sharp English. "Establish clearance here." Sentries acted swiftly, preparing an area of snow adjacent to the barrier. The captives gathered collectively, murmuring prayers. What were they distributing? Munitions? Apparatus? Negative. When the initial containers contacted the terrain, the empty impact wasn't metallic. It was timber. And when one fractured beneath the pressure of the descent, the females witnessed what emerged and inhaled sharply. The timber containers separated like skeletal structures, releasing not projectiles, but loaves. Dark grain bread, containers of preserved meat, secured vessels of powdered dairy. Vapor ascended from damaged broth cauldrons as Allied troops extracted additional provisions, accumulating them knee-level in the frozen precipitation. The females simply gazed, nourishment for them. Following days of diluted liquid and spoiled fragments, the vision was nearly indecent. A single British non-commissioned officer commanded, "Maintain distance." Yet no fury existed within it, merely discipline. The sentries operated productively, establishing collapsible surfaces and illumination beneath a protective covering. The procession's personnel functioned silently, rehearsed and exact, distributing everything with the cadence of an assembly operation. Each container bore stenciled characters, U.S. Army Ration Type B. A medical officer activated a portable light examining features, hollow facial structures, azure mouths, cold damaged extremities. He recorded observations on a document holder and uttered, "Bloody hell, they're severely malnourished." His assessment wasn't inaccurate. Documentation subsequently revealed the females had been existing on scarcely 900 calories daily. Under 50% of the Geneva Convention's mandated 2,100. For the German captives, it defied comprehension. Why would the adversary nourish them superior to how their native military ever had? One among them murmured, "They respect regulations even when nobody observes." Another communicated nothing whatsoever, her vision secured on the bread. Then arrived the broth, substantial, heated, producing vapor. Allied culinary personnel distributed it into metal containers. The aroma arrived initially, protein, alliums, something abundant and authentic. A single female paused, then consumed a portion. Moisture descended her features before she could prevent it. "The adversary nourished us through regulation," she would subsequently document. "Our native military had not." Even the sentries appeared uncomfortable observing the females consume their initial complete sustenance in weeks. This wasn't compassion. It was protocol. component of an Allied Red Cross examination scheduled that week. The British commanding officer who'd instructed them outdoors verified his timepiece again, uttered, "Prepare the photographic equipment." That final statement caused everyone to become motionless. A photographic device. The females shared cautious expressions. They suspected this might constitute propaganda, validation for the global community that the Allies demonstrated humanity while the Reich starved its population. Vapor spiraled into the darkness, illuminated by the lamps like spectral pillars. Somewhere past the barrier, a subtle metallic sound fractured the quietness, like a mechanism opening, prepared to document what arrived next. The metallic sounds reverberated across the frozen atmosphere, piercing, purposeful, nearly ritualistic. A British medical officer elevated a compact Leica rangefinder camera, its metallic borders capturing the lamplight. Another soldier modified the floodlight positioning, composing the formation of German females grasping metal containers, vapor spiraling from their broth. The captives stiffened immediately. Certain individuals averted their gaze, others drew covers more securely around their frames. To them, this instant felt like vulnerability, not salvation, propaganda. One muttered in abbreviated German, "They'll transmit our features to London publications." Yet the Allied medical officers weren't displaying satisfaction. They were recording everything for the Red Cross, the provisions, the sanitation, the circumstances. Every perspective held significance because this constituted validation that regulations persisted even in perdition. By 1945, Allied medical divisions had documented over 3,000 photographic examinations of prisoner facilities. Each photograph captured calories distributed, sleeping platforms per individual, even cleansing agent distribution. It was administrative procedure transformed into compassion, frigid, methodical, relentless. The females didn't comprehend it yet, but these photographs would eventually be displayed in Geneva as verification that the Allies maintained the convention their native commanders had labeled a bourgeois vulnerability. The photographic mechanism clicked again, preserving minute, delicate demonstrations of endurance. A young woman from Bremen, no older than 20, concealed her features behind her container. A medical worker adjacent to her corrected her stance as though instinctively preparing for evaluation. A single officer in the rear, her uniform still displaying the Luftwaffe emblem, gazed directly at the optical device, unwavering. That photograph would subsequently emerge in Allied documentation labeled simply, "Female prisoner, France, December 1944. We had transformed into specimens in their compassion," one female recollected subsequently. The concept penetrated more profoundly than starvation, because for years they had been informed the Allies were savages, violators, abominations, individuals without integrity. Yet now, beneath piercing illumination, they were being attended to, photographed, and nourished by the alleged adversary of civilization. The contradiction caused anguish. The British commanding officer supervising the documentation provided a subtle acknowledgement to his medical officer. "Following segment," he stated, "bathing facilities." The phrase suspended in the atmosphere like an invisible catalyst. The females became immobile. In their consciousness, the phrase bathing facilities had become equivalent with a single reality. The commanding officer rotated away, oblivious to the tempest he had just provoked within every captive's consciousness. When the phrase bathing facilities contacted the atmosphere, the complete formation of females remained stationary. Implements ceased making contact. An individual released a container. It fractured in the frozen precipitation like a weapon discharge. The sentries didn't respond. They merely gestured toward the cleansing structure where technical personnel were already examining the conduits. Vapor expelled from oxidized mechanisms. the atmosphere saturated with that subtle metallic essence of aged water, purified yet sufficiently acute to activate alarm. Within the quarters, the females had communicated in hushed tones for months regarding the eastern facilities, locations where bathing facilities signified termination. Nobody comprehended what was authentic anymore. Speculation traveled more rapidly than logic. So, when the Allied commanding officer instructed, "Arrange them for examination," cardiac organs constricted, a medical worker from Hamburg murmured, "They wouldn't, would they?" Another shook her cranium, uncertain. A British technical specialist rotated a mechanism. The conduit emitted sound for 3 seconds. Nothing occurred. Then, with a spurting sound and an emission, authentic water exploded through the outlets, heated, constant, vital. Vapor surged outward into the nocturnal atmosphere. The acoustic was overwhelming in its normalcy. A single female advanced, quivering, extended outward, and permitted the flow to contact her palm. It was heated. She released breath for the initial occasion in days. Documentation indicates that nearly 90% of captured female auxiliaries had encountered certain variations of the poisonous gas bathing facility speculation before imprisonment. It had constructed their terrors, determined their conduct. Now, as the vapor saturated the passage, that fabrication terminated quietly in the interval between incredulity and alleviation. "The terror departed our physical forms like vapor," one journal subsequently stated. No utterances, merely the acoustic of flowing water. The technical specialists displayed subtle satisfaction. Another examination completed, another requirement fulfilled. Yet the females remained, positioned in the moisture, as though recovering from months of frigid dread. One among them expressed amusement suddenly, brief and anxious, then concealed her mouth. The acoustic startled everyone. It had been weeks since amusement contacted this location. Externally, the British commanding officer secured his document holder, observing back at the obscured apertures where silhouettes of females relocated gradually, cleansing their features. He wasn't emotional. It was merely protocol, yet even he paused momentarily as vapor spiraled past the lamps, transforming the darkness gentle. That vapor ascending against the frozen obscurity indicated a transition nobody could identify yet. Something had fractured, not the captives, but the separation between captor and captive. The vapor suspended in the nocturnal atmosphere extended after the mechanisms were deactivated. Within the quarters, covers were accumulated on sleeping platforms, purified towels arranged systematically, and vessels of something that produced an aroma resembling coffee anticipated on a timber surface. The females proceeded inward quietly, vision shifting from the sentries to the provisions. The identical British commanding officer who had instructed them outward hours previously now positioned himself aside, limbs folded, permitting them to advance individually. No bellowing, no weapons, merely discipline and warmth. The initial consumption of coffee nearly devastated one among them. It wasn't acrid, not military distributed residue, but something abundant and enhanced with sweetener. Her mouth quivered. She murmured, "Sweetening substance," surrounding her. Others massaged warmth back into their extremities, grasping wool covers like protection. A British medical worker advanced through the formation, examining cold damage and wrapping damaged tissue. She communicated gently, nearly with apology. "You're protected now." It was the initial sentence of benevolence many had ever perceived in English. For years, propaganda had illustrated that vocal tone as monstrous, inhuman. Now it was repairing their extremities. By early 1945, the British government was expending nearly £1.3 million each month on medical attention for Axis prisoners, an industrial-scale demonstration of humanity that astonished even impartial witnesses. For the captives, this warmth was more alarming than brutality. Brutality they comprehended. Compassion demanded they reconsider everything. One German female, previously a clerical worker for the Luftwaffe, gazed into her vessel and uttered, "If they can regard us as individuals, what purpose were we struggling for?" Nobody responded. The inquiry suspended more substantially than the frozen atmosphere. Sentries distributed themselves, providing cleansing agents and grooming implements. A soldier produced melodic sounds beneath his respiration, something cheerful, unrestrained. The females didn't participate, yet their frames relaxed. The quarters commenced to produce human acoustics again. Subdued conversation, utensils contacting metal, a solitary expression of amusement emerging and rapidly diminishing. Externally, the gale had terminated. The procession had departed, abandoning merely tire impressions saturated with frozen precipitation. The British commanding officer ignited a tobacco product, observing combustion spiral upward where vapor had existed hours previously. His non-commissioned officer approached. "Peculiar spectacle, sir," he communicated. The commanding officer released breath. Compassion always appears peculiar in uniform. Yet this warmth wasn't merely benevolence. It was a preliminary stage. Tomorrow, the identical medical worker who transported them. Covers would transport them documentation booklets, writing implements, and inquiries. Morning arrived colorless and subdued. The frozen precipitation on the transparent barriers had commenced to dissolve, descending like moisture. On the surface, where vessels of coffee had positioned hours previously, rested documentation booklets, writing implements, and tobacco products arranged in systematic formations. The identical British medical worker who distributed bandaging materials now displayed gentle satisfaction and stated, "Ladies, please assume seating positions." This wasn't the questioning session they anticipated. No bellowing, no intense lamps in their features, no intimidations, merely warmth. A senior officer in a systematically pressed uniform entered, transporting a compact accumulation of documents. He communicated calmly, his vocal quality nearer to an educator than a captor. "Let's commence simply," he stated. "Inform me regarding your occupation with communications." The females shared expressions. Was this another deception? Yet then, individually, they comprehended the cadence had transformed. The Allies had transitioned from destroying resistance to constructing connection, a technique designed not to demolish dignity, but to render truth feel protected. Between 1943 and 1945, over 4,200 Allied commanding officers were instructed in connection extraction, the technique of dialogue as an instrument more acute than terror. A single female, a stenographer from Munich, paused. The senior officer presented her a tobacco product. Combustible? She blinked, acknowledged, accepted it. The ignition source illuminated between them. A minute armistice. Minutes transformed into 60 minutes. Inquiries transitioned between informal discussion regarding nourishment, regarding families, regarding her duration of service. By the instance, she comprehended what she'd communicated. The diagram in her consciousness had already transferred onto the document. Externally, the facility's amplification system transmitted a BBC transmission in imperfect German. Intelligence of Allied progressions in Belgium. The females absorbed in quietness. The Reich was contracting by the 60 minutes. Internally, the senior officer stated gently, "This conflict is terminating. You comprehend." They didn't fracture us. One prisoner would subsequently document. They rendered us desire to communicate. It wasn't merely tactical planning. It was cognitive disharmony. The adversary's benevolence felt neutralizing, surgical. The females who had previously typed instructions for aerial bombardment operations now articulated petroleum pathways, wireless codes, even storage facility coordinates. And it wasn't from terror. It was from liberation. When the session terminated, the senior officer ascended, expressed gratitude to them courteously, and abandoned a partially vacant package of tobacco products behind. A single female gazed at it for an extended duration, the material still heated from his extremities. Externally, petroleum motors produced rumbling acoustics again, another procession approaching. This occasion it wasn't nourishment they transported, but what her utterances would immediately release. Procession's motors produced humming acoustics externally, subtle yet constant, while internally the questioning structure, a solitary lamp, projected extended shadows across the surface. The female, from Munich, the individual who had communicated the maximum, remained positioned gazing at the document before her. Her tobacco product combusted downward to the filtration component, uncontacted. The senior officer inclined forward, vocal tone subdued, patient. "You referenced encoded transmissions near Nancy. Can you illustrate it?" Her extremity trembled slightly, then stabilized. The writing implement created scratching acoustics across the document, indicating lines between minute points, transmission positions, petroleum storage locations, a concealed wireless tower disguised as an agricultural structure. She wasn't betraying anyone, she informed herself. She was merely clarifying. Yet as the diagram expanded more detailed, she comprehended precisely what she was relinquishing. Within 48 hours, Allied aerial observation confirmed it. A hidden German petroleum reserve east of Nancy. Sufficient petroleum to energize an armored regiment for 7 days. Several coordinates from a captive's illustration had just preserved existences. 15 Allied processions, documentation subsequently stated, redirected in temporal opportunity to circumvent assault. A subdued acknowledgement had relocated thousands of individuals and apparatus. In the facility that darkness, she couldn't achieve unconsciousness. She absorbed to the transport vehicles externally, the subdued idling of motors she now comprehended she had safeguarded. "I didn't betray anyone," she murmured to the obscurity. "I merely communicated the truth, finally." Perhaps she accepted it. Perhaps she required to. The senior officer composed his documentation with clinical exactness. He didn't record her hesitation or the vibration in her vocal expression. Merely conclusions. Intelligence dependable. Cross-examined and validated. Recommend humane treatment persisted. By sunrise, instructions arrived from superior command. Compensation for collaboration. Supervised outdoor activity permitted. For the initial occasion since imprisonment, the females were authorized beyond the interior wire. The sentry accessed the entrance without ritual, merely an acknowledgement. The frigid temperature contacted their features like renewal. They advanced cautiously into the accessible terrain beyond the barrier. The frozen precipitation illuminated beneath the morning solar body, excessively intense, excessively purified. Several females observed back at the facility, partially anticipating it to vanish. Yet it didn't. It positioned there, ordinary and substantial, like a peculiar new territory. Somewhere in that frozen quietness, the female from Munich released breath. She had modified the diagram of a conflict, and now the diagram of her individual captivity was preparing to transition too. The entrance produced creaking acoustics just following sunrise. Frozen precipitation glistened on the wire barriers, and the sentry's respiration formed vapor formations in the colorless atmosphere. "Proceed forward," he stated simply, indicating toward the accessible terrain. For a cardiac rhythm, nobody relocated. Then the initial female advanced forward, footwear crushing into untouched frozen precipitation. It was the identical landscape they'd observed at for weeks, yet without the barrier, it felt unauthentic. Beyond the boundary, the world appeared more expansive, more tranquil, more ancient. They advanced in pairs, accompanied by 2 unarmed sentries, toward the frozen grassland. In the remoteness, an agricultural worker propelled a transportation device through the accumulation, gesturing once before vanishing into the haze. For the German females, this elementary walk was inconceivable liberty. No bellowing, no weapons directed at their dorsal regions, merely ventilation and accessible terrain. Certain individuals stooped to collect wild vegetation fragments. Others massaged their extremities in the frozen precipitation as though to validate it was authentic. One female uttered, "I had forgotten what frigid vegetation produced for aroma." Another responded, "I had forgotten I could ambulate this distance." By spring 1945, Allied Command had discreetly authorized outdoor labor initiatives for minimal-risk prisoners. Over 60 facilities throughout Europe permitted controlled occupation assignments, purifying transportation routes, cultivating terrain, or restoring barriers. For numerous captives, the sensation of relocation itself felt restorative. Following months of restriction, the cadence of excavation implements and footfalls produced acoustics like cardiac rhythm returning. Sentries presented no dialogue, merely brief acknowledgments. Yet even those movements transported significance. A distributed tobacco product during intermission, a minimal expression of amusement at an awkward descent. These were separations in the structure that had previously divided adversary from human. One female, observing at the distant line, murmured to the sentry adjacent to her, "It's peculiar. Liberty doesn't feel like triumph." He didn't respond, merely observed her utterances vanish into the haze. Subsequently, she would document, "Liberty tasted like frigid atmosphere, not emblems." When they returned to the facility, their facial structures combusted crimson, not from disgrace or elevated temperature, but from vitality. For the initial occasion, the quarters vibrated with something, alternative to terror. Yet at the entrance, as they re-entered, a new transport vehicle positioned itself, its motor producing rumbling acoustics subdued, its dorsal apertures rotating accessible. Within, additional females, depleted, hollow-visioned, enveloped in Luftwaffe azure coverings. And as one among them descended, the female from Munich became immobile. That facial structure, she recognized it. The new participants stumbled from the transport vehicle like apparitions, facial structures gray with frigid temperature, uniforms fragmented, vision expansive and vacant. Their coverings still displayed the Luftwaffe designation, partially fragmented and saturated with earth. The females who had just returned from their brief experience of liberty became immobile where they positioned. One among the newcomers paused at the entrance, examining the collective, her observation secured onto a recognizable facial structure. "Anna," the female from Munich murmured. It was her previous superior, a previously dignified clerical worker who had transmitted instructions at her in a subterranean communications structure outside Cologne. During that period, Anna had worn cosmetic coloration, transported herself as though the Reich itself would never deteriorate. Now she appeared 10 years more aged, trembling, grasping a deformed water container. The sentry relocated aside. "Internally," he stated. Anna relocated gradually, her footwear creating dragging acoustics. When she witnessed her previous subordinate, she attempted to position herself more elevated, yet her physical form wouldn't comply. "You're positioned here too," she succeeded to communicate. The utterances fractured. The female acknowledged. "Since December." Within the quarters, the opposition was severe. The newcomers produced aromas of petroleum and combustion residue. They hadn't consumed properly in weeks. When the medical worker distributed broth, Anna recoiled at the vision of Allied uniforms. "Don't contact it," she expressed with force at another captive. It's a deception. Yet starvation demolished dignity rapidly. Within minutes, she was consuming from the identical metal vessel she had previously refused to distribute with subordinates. By conflict's termination, approximately 20% of female prisoners originated from Luftwaffe auxiliary classifications, wireless technicians, stenographers, anti-aircraft personnel. The majority had accepted themselves invulnerable, performing in administrative locations distant from blood and earth. Yet imprisonment eliminated designations and classifications bare. In captivity, everyone wore the identical fatigue gray garment. That darkness Anna positioned adjacent to her previous subordinate on the identical sleeping platform, a solitary cover over their lower limbs. "I relinquished everything," she uttered, gazing at the floor structures. "And for what purpose?" The female from Munich communicated. Nothing. Merely transferred her the final fragment of bread. The quietness between them was more substantial than acknowledgement. In the obscurity, the facility electrical generator produced humming acoustics. Externally, frozen precipitation commenced to descend again, gentle, persistent, acoustic-less. For the initial occasion, Anna didn't transmit instructions to anyone. She simply inclined dorsally, vision sealed, her vocal expression scarcely a murmur. "We constructed a fabrication, didn't we?" Nobody responded. Yet that inquiry wouldn't vanish. It would pursue them both into sorrow. The electrical generator's subdued humming blended with the gradual cadence of respiration within the quarters. The two females positioned on the identical sleeping platform, previously officer and subordinate, now indistinguishable, beneath the identical wool cover. Externally, frozen rain contacted metal roof structures. Internally, utterances finally discovered their trajectory outward. Anna's vocal expression was fragile. "We combusted documentation every 7 days, identifications, instructions, consignments. I perceived that rendered me faithful." The female from Munich didn't interrupt, she merely absorbed. The acknowledgement wasn't regarding culpability. It was regarding incredulity. The Reich had guaranteed them integrity. Now they were removing frozen precipitation from transparent barriers merely to witness solar illumination. They communicated in segments through the darkness, regarding transmissions they'd previously accepted, regarding visual documentation of champions who never returned, regarding commanding officers who vanished when provisions depleted. By the second 60-minute period, quietness established again, more substantial yet more purified. "I previously perceived surrender was disgrace," Anna murmured. "Now it feels like authenticity." Throughout Europe, post-conflict Allied documentation would subsequently record that nearly 68% of imprisoned German auxiliaries rejected National Socialist allegiance within 6 months of captivity. Not because of intimidation, but because daily existence dismantled fabrication fragment by fragment, heated sustenance, publications, equitable treatment, the vision of troops regarding them as humans instead of implements. For Anna, the transformation wasn't instantaneous. It arrived in minimal, severe recognitions. The flavor of Allied bread, the acoustic of British medical workers producing melodic sounds, the non-existence of animosity in the vision of their sentries. "They should possess animosity toward us," she uttered. "Yet they don't," her companion responded quietly. "Perhaps that's the reason they triumph." No magnificent communications pursued, merely distributed exhaustion. When the illumination deactivated for the darkness, the two females remained conscious, gazing at the ceiling's timber structural components, their silhouettes combined into one. Somewhere externally, a transport vehicle motor initiated, a recognizable humming acoustic progressing through the facility like repeated experience. Anna rotated her cranium toward the acoustic. "They're approaching again?" she inquired. The sentry externally validated it. Procession in the morning. You'll desire to be prepared. The females shared an expression, this occasion not of terror, but of something that nearly resembled tranquility. They didn't comprehend it yet, but those motors would transport them not more profoundly into captivity, but toward liberation. At initial illumination, the motors returned, recognizable, constant, unhurried. Yet this occasion, the sentry's stance was distinct. No tension, no weapons elevated, merely subdued productivity as instructions transferred down the formation. Accumulate your possessions, one transmitted vocally. Transportation prepared. The females gazed at him, uncertain whether to accept it. Liberation had transformed into fabrication, a narrative communicated to comfort the desperate. Yet beyond the wire, the identical transport vehicles that previously transported nourishment and petroleum now idled with accessible rear closures. Their emissions spiraled into the morning frigid temperature like spectral standards. It was spring 1946. The frozen precipitation had departed, substituted by defrosting earth and colorless vegetation. The conflict had terminated nearly 1 year previously, yet the consequences still existed in their skeletal structures. The females formed a formation in quietness, transporting minimal accumulations, wool neck coverings, water containers, several communications inscribed on Allied documentation material. As they advanced through the entrance, sentries acknowledged respectfully. No celebratory acoustics, no instructions, no resentment. Merely fatigued facial structures and the acoustic of footwear on partially melted material. The identical British commanding officer who'd previously transmitted them outward at midnight now simply stated, "Domestic transportation, nothing additional." Individually, they ascended onto the transport vehicles. The female from Munich observed dorsally at the facility, the quarters, the wire barriers, the elevated structure where floodlights had previously transformed darkness into evaluation. Now it positioned subdued, nearly gentle beneath the morning obscurity. She rotated to Anna. "It's terminated," she stated. Anna's response was scarcely audible. "Perhaps now we commence." According to Allied documentation, by mid-1946, more than 420,000 Axis prisoners had been returned from Western Europe. The majority returned to devastated urban locations, combusted outward, families dispersed, nations unidentifiable. Yet many transported something the Reich could never have relinquished them: perspective, the variety that expands merely where authority terminates. The transport vehicles progressed eastward, wheels crushing through liquid accumulations, motors producing humming acoustics, a fatigued melody. Nobody communicated. The transportation route extended forward like an extended gray fabric beneath a colorless celestial region. The atmosphere produced aromas subtly of petroleum and defrosted terrain, indications of both conflict and restoration. At the following curvature, the facility vanished from observation. Merely quietness remained, fractured by the remote transmission of corvids. The female from Munich sealed her vision and permitted the frigid atmosphere to saturate her respiratory organs. "We departed with complete digestive organs," she would subsequently document, "and vacant cardiac organs." And somewhere dorsally to them, the floodlights remained obscure permanently.